This is a man who needs no introduction. So it's Chris Bird, old friend of David's, quite an old bloke really, but he's also a film editor, a film geek, like most of us, and a good friend. So here's Chris Bird to do our tribute to David.
Thank you. So it's just over a year since we lost our friend David Wyatt. He was a quiet and modest man, and yet his achievements were prodigious, a lot more than many people here recognise. He was an internationally respected film historian with an immense knowledge not just of silent comedy, but of early cinema and comedy in general. He was, of course, famously a major film collector and showed some of his rarities here at the Cinema Museum, at conventions in Britain and America, and even on television. He co-founded this silent laughter event and was hugely instrumental in setting up Bristol Slapstick, as well as organising film events at the Museum of London. In recent years, he collaborated on 3 superb crowd-funded releases with his close friend Dave Glass of the films of Lupino Lane, Lloyd Hamilton and Billy Bevan, some of which drew on prints from his own collection. One of his most impressive achievements was, with Garth Pedler, to undertake the huge volume of research that became the 9.5mm vintage film encyclopedia. I haven't brought it because it's so huge it's virtually unliftable, but it's now found in archives around the world, and this incredibly important piece of work could not have happened without him. He found several lost films, including the early Disney film Little Red Riding Hood, and the early film featuring Laurel and Hardy but not as a team yet, Now I'll Tell One. He also found the only complete copy of a very early George Formby film, Boots Boots, and at the time of his death, he and I were collaborating on a lost Charles Ray film, of which he'd found the only known copy, called Dynamite Smith, which Dave Glass has scanned and is now available to see on YouTube. But in addition to all of that, he was also an award-winning filmmaker, a film editor and a film researcher. So Dave Glass and I have picked out some rare clips that we hope will give you a sense of the breadth of David Wyatt's achievements and interests. One of his oldest and closest friends was David Cleveland. David Cleveland grew up on a farm in Norfolk, but went on to become a cinema projectionist, then did a traineeship at the BBC and became a filmmaker. He then set up the first regional film archive in the UK, the East Anglian Film Archive, in 1976. They were long-standing friends and they made many films together. Now, sadly, David Cleveland isn't able to be here today, but has very kindly recorded a tribute for us to run instead. So, Phil, could we please have the first clip?
Hello. My name's David Cleveland. I was a friend of David Wyatt's for a long time. We met at the BBC in the late 1960s, and we quickly got together because we were interested in comedy and old films and cartoons and things. So we quickly became friends. Going back a bit, in 1967 I had started making these white-coated prof films for Vision On. And Tony Amos and I, who did them, worked quite hard, but by 1970 we were quite busy. We had to meet deadlines and the films got more complicated and we needed help, and Dave Wyatt was the obvious person, and he came along and he was a vital element into our filmmaking of the prof films, with ideas and tricks and all the things we did. We made these films all the time at weekends on a farm in Essex while we were still at work, and we did that until 1976 when the programme was taken off the air. We were then asked by Clive Doig, who was the director on Vision On, who was now producer-director of his own programme called Jigsaw with Janet Ellis, whether we could make some little comedy items I put on a different coloured coat. It was a Sherlock Holmes coat, incidentally, which had been used by Harry Corbett in Carry On Screaming. I've still got it. And we made these little films on the same farm weekly for Jigsaw from 1979 through 3 series to 1981. Each week we were supposed to make a short film with our Sherlock Holmes character called Sid Sleuth. The idea being there would be a clue in the film for the audience to latch onto. The only thing is we never put any clues in, so Clive got rid of us. So that was that. But Dave Wyatt was a great friend. It was strange really because we always called him Dave. But one day I spoke to him about this. I said, do you like being called Dave? No, he said, I'd much prefer to be called David. So from then on, we called him David. He used to come round to our house quite regularly. We had film shows, had films he'd found, old comedies, cartoons, you know, the sort of things he used to collect. He'd always been a collector. I remember in the early days, in the 1960s, I think it was, I went round to his house at Redbridge, where his mum and dad lived and he lived, and he said, I'll show you the film collection. And he opened a door, he tried to open a door, and inside were piles of cans all round the door, you couldn't get in. Anyway, that was Dave Wyatt. My children, my 3 girls, loved him coming round because they said, Dave Wyatt is cool. You're not. Anyway, we had a wonderful time with David coming round here and looking at these films. We had a lot of laughter and it was great fun. We used to phone at each other with some sort of film we'd heard about or seen on the internet or something like that. I remember not long before he died, I'd found a little piece on the internet from an old American musical TV program called Haw Haw, where there was a That's Good, That's Bad sequence gag, and I was about to tell him about this when I had heard the sad news he had died. But he lives on in all of us. David, we miss you.
Thank you. So let's take a look at some of these Vision On films, which are, out of interest, how many people, can you put up your hand if you've ever seen any of those Vision On? Oh, a lot. That's amazing. Okay, great. Well, fortunately, these have been scanned from the original 60mm elements by Bob Gagan. The sound on them hasn't survived in such good shape, so I'm afraid there's quite a lot of crackle and pops on it. I have tried using different sources for them, but they've all got the same problems. Now, both David Wyatt and David Cleveland, when I talked about these films, were very modest about them. They seemed to think they were some little bits of fun they did when they were young and then moved on. I genuinely think they're little gems. I think they are descended directly from films like the Polydor film that Tony Fletcher showed us just before lunch, where all the effects are done in the camera. There's none of it done in the optical printer. It's all done in the camera or in the editing. And they're simple, but they have some of that DNA in them, I think. And they are, in a sense, bona fide silent comedies, albeit with music and effects tracks, made decades after the era ended. So we're going to look, I've pulled out a few of them for you to see now. And now Dave Wyatt at this era doesn't appear in them. He's behind the camera, but he's one of the 2 or 3, depending, filmmakers of them. But look out, in one of them that features a Gaumont Chrono film projector, you'll get a tiny glimpse of David as one of the custard pie throwers. Thank you. So we're going to be interspersing clips like that from various other tributes from major figures in David's life. Now, when I was asked to inform various people of David's passing a year ago, I was extremely moved by the reactions from the American film historians in particular. He was clearly held in extremely high regard by such titans as Steve Masser, Rob Stone, Russell Merritt and Richard M. Roberts. So we're going to have a short tribute now from Rob Stone from the Library of Congress. Thank you.
It was, I don't know, about 30 years ago, I had this great idea that I wanted to write a book on Laurel and Hardy solo films. So I worked on it for 5 or 6 years, and then I had this big idea. I'll go to a Sons of the Desert convention in New York City and see if I can meet some people and find out some more information. The first person I walked up to says, "Hey, what are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I'm writing a book on Laurel and Hardy solo films." They said, "Oh, there's another guy here that's writing a book too." My heart sank. I was despondent. I'd spent 5 or 6 years on this, and somebody else has already got the same idea. So they pointed me out to this guy named Dave Wyatt. And so I walked up and said, "Hey, how are you? I'm writing a book on the solo films too. Here's my manuscript. Tell me what you think." And so Dave came back the next day and said, "Man, you are so far ahead of me. What can I do to help?" And at that point, a 30-year friendship was began. And I don't know. I guess it happens more than not. Maybe it doesn't. But there are those few times in your lives when you meet somebody and you know instantly that you're going to be fast friends. And that was the case with Mr. Wyatt. That led to many exchanges of letters and phone calls. I think QVC's midnight shift paid for an awful lot of those. And we ended up with, this little thing called Laurel or Hardy, and it really was a mutual labor of love. And through the years, Dave and I have remained good friends, remained in contact. When I'm in England, I see him. When he comes to America, he hangs out with us, including one kind of interesting road trip with Dave Glass and Mr. Dave Wyatt and Rob Stone. But you know, we always made sure we saw each other, made sure we hung out. Dave, God, I'm not sure there's anyone that knows more than the guy knows, and I'm not sure there's anybody that's more self-effacing than Dave. He really had a way to kind of make a little bit fun of himself. I was just going through some notes on a revision of the book that I'm working on, and there was a letter from Dave, and at the end it's signed Dave Wyatt, struggling author, with little asterisks, and then down below it says, not much of an author, but a great struggler. And I love that, because that kind of explains Dave Wyatt to you. You know, miss the guy. I was fortunate to see him about a month before he passed. My wife and I were in England, and we went out to dinner with him and Dave Glass and Lord Dave Heath, and as we were walking to the cars, I said, hey, you know, I'll make sure I start sending you pages on the revision to the book, so that you know, that we would both be involved in that. And it's going to be hard doing it without him. It's hard doing most anything without him. And you know, as all of you that sit around watching films today, you kind of know an awful lot of that's because Dave Wyatt made it happen. He's one of those guys where he will never get the credit that he deserves, but he will be missed greatly. And I guess that's my thoughts on Dave Wyatt. I'm not sure how much of a tribute it is, but it is devastating that he isn't with us, and miss him greatly. Thanks.
So let's have a proper glimpse now at David in front of the camera. So you've had a tiny glimpse of the Jigsaw films that David Cleveland and David Wyatt made following on from Vision On. And the big change here was that David Wyatt was now an equal of David Cleveland's in front of the camera as a long-running burglar character to David Cleveland's rather inept detective. Now, sadly, these don't seem to survive at all on film, as far as we can find out. David always told me that Thames were supposed to return the 60mm masters to them, but didn't. So David only had VHS copies, which I've got copies of, and I've managed to, I wouldn't say restore them, but cobble in a few missing fragments from other sources. So they don't exist in the same quality, but I think they're great. So we've got 4 of them for you now. Thank you. Now, it will come as a surprise to, I suspect, no one in the audience that David was a tremendous fan of Laurel and Hardy. I've mentioned that he found a very early Laurel and Hardy film, Now I'll Tell One, and one of his very last acts was to help save a nitrate print of With Love and Hisses, which is the copy that's now on the Flicker Alley Blu-ray, and which we're screening later in the weekend. So let's have a tribute now from David's Sons of the Desert friend, Roger Robinson. Thank you.
There are some people that you meet and instantly sense that you're on the same wavelength. I met Dave in 1989 at my first Sons of the Desert meeting in Rochester, Kent. He was showing rare clips of Laurel and Hardy films to a spellbound audience, something he continued to do for the rest of his all too short life. He willingly shared material. His reward was being that people enjoyed and appreciated what he was showing. In July 1994, we decided that we would jointly do a special presentation of Laurel and Hardy films at the Grand Order of Water Rats in Gray's Inn Road in London. It was a success. Years later, we returned to the Rats HQ and gathered information about Laurel and Hardy's involvement, which resulted in Dave writing a chapter for our joint book, It Sure Is, about the comedian's first tour of the UK in 1947. Dave shared my passion in researching and writing articles, although I have to admit he didn't have to do as much research as me because he already retained an astounding depth of knowledge. I loved his style of writing, as it contained a pinch of wit, a teaspoon of wisdom, and a bucket full of facts. After his terrible house fire in 2009, Dave made a slow but remarkable recovery. I invited him to write a regular article for my quarterly Laurel and Hardy magazine, The Periwinkle. We corroborated on another book project, Hard-Boiled Eggs and Nuts, celebrating 100 years of Laurel and Hardy. I think it was rather ambitious to invite 100 Sons of the Desert to write different articles about the comedians and our fraternal organisation. But it worked out just fine. Dave was integral in contacting many key figures, authors, actors, and persons involved in comedy. Gosh, I miss him. The Sons of the Desert miss him. We all miss him. Dave, we will never forget you, and thanks for being my pal.
And straight on to another tribute from, amongst many other things, Laurel and Hardy expert Serge Bromberg, who was responsible for the recent Blu-ray. Thank you.
Well, there's not much I can say about Dave. He has been a friend for 25 years. We're here in Pordenone, as you can see, and well, Pordenone without his smile and his friendship is totally different. You know, you would come to you and say, "Oh, I found something amazing." It was never really exactly what you would expect to be amazing, but because he had so much enthusiasm, we were happy that he had made that discovery. Now, Dave was one of the members of the Laurel and Hardy Silent project, and he was looking for prints on the 1927, 28, and 29 films. He found a few. He found one or two instrumental prints, and the last message I had from him was August 16. That's about 2 months before he went away, and he asked permission to screen the Laurel and Hardy films, even if they were not totally completed, but he asked permission in one of those shows. So Dave, if you hear me, wherever you are, you can show all the Laurel and Hardy you want, as much as you want, with your usual enthusiasm. I'm sure they'll love it.
So after that, I think it's probably high time we had some Laurel and Hardy. Now, in addition to being a huge fan of theirs, David was also a big admirer of the compilation films of Robert Youngson, who was very instrumental in bringing back silent comedy to a more general audience in the 60s. So the clip we're going to show comes from one of these films, one of the Robert Youngson compilations, and we're going to be running it with the original soundtrack, as David would probably have experienced it when he was young. So thank you very much, Laurel and Hardy.
The picture is called Liberty, and liberty is just what Stan and Oliver have foremost on their minds. Written and directed by Leo McCarey, this comedy was released in 1929, when Laurel and Hardy had reached their peak, and both the laughing 20s and the golden age of silent comedy were drawing to a close. We brought your clothes from the old apartment, says Getaway Gus. Stan has traveling trousers and Oliver's in a pinch. We'd better switch pants, says Hardy.
So we're going to hear now two short tributes from two musician friends of David's, both of whom have played on multiple occasions for films from his collection. So we're going to hear from Neil Brand, followed straight away by John Sweeney.
I miss Dave hugely. It's mainly because when I saw him, I knew that there was going to be a laugh around. His huge laugh, his knowledge of comedy. The fact that when you met him after even years, the first thing he'd say to you would be, sorry. Now, I keep seeing him, and I think this is the biggest tribute I can pay to him. I keep seeing him at festivals, and I go, oh, there's Dave. He's left a big hole, Dave. He loved so many different things, and he did so many different things, and he knew so many of us from so many different places. And yet he was just absolutely Dave to every last one of us. What you see is what you get, what it said on the tin. He loved his films, he loved his ladies, he loved his friends, he loved a laugh. And I really will miss that so very much.
I guess I first got to meet and to know David when we started off with the Kennington Bioscope. He was there from very early on, bringing films in. And he always brought things in a very unassuming manner. It was never like, you should be really grateful for this or whatever. And it was the same thing with his knowledge. It soon became clear to me he had a huge encyclopedic knowledge, but he wore it very lightly. And he was perfectly happy for you to disagree with him, as I did on many occasions with Walter Ford's films, for example, which I didn't share anything like the same enthusiasm that he had. And often when he'd bring in some unknown bit of silent comedy to screen, afterwards he'd kind of look at me with a slightly sort of impish smile, like, did you like it? Sometimes I did and sometimes I didn't, but I was just so grateful for all that he brought to the Bioscope and all that he showed in terms of both himself, in terms of presenting the comedy weekends, and all the extraordinary kind of contacts he had. I remember at the last comedy weekend when he had the interview with, I think it was Lupino Lane's granddaughter, I can't remember, a relative, a descendant of Lupino Lane, who happened to have home movies of Lupino Lane, which we were then able to screen. That was just kind of extraordinary. And you know, he was perfectly happy to share that with us at the Bioscope rather than some kind of more high-profile, important, inverted commas, sort of gig. So I feel deeply grateful to have known him and deeply sad of his passing. But we all have our memories and things which he gave us, and I guess that's going to live on through our memories of him and his work.
So, since David was such a fan of Walter Ford, I think you should be able to make up your own minds on this. So we're going to give you a 3-minute extract from a film called Walter Makes a Movie from a 9.5mm print. And to play for this and later silent clips, we're delighted to welcome Colin Sell. Thank you, Colin. That's David Wyatt's own transfer of his own print. He made transfers of a number of things like that so he could show them at places like Slapstick On. So that's David's own transfer of his own print. Now, I mentioned in my intro that David Wyatt was an award-winning filmmaker, which isn't necessarily that widely known. In 1979, he won a 10 Best Award. Now, the 10 Best Awards are now gone and forgotten, but they were, in their day, massively esteemed things that were for amateur filmmakers, and it meant you had made one of the 10 best independent amateur films of the year. And they were very, very coveted. They were a sort of amateur version of the Oscars. And David won a prize, one of the 10 best, for a film he made with Finchley Cine Society in 1979 called The Great Pram Race, which we'll show a bit of in a minute. But before we do, courtesy of Susan Seigan, I can actually show you this is David Wyatt's actual 10 Best Award for the film you're about to see. And this was presented to him by John Mills himself. So a little bit of David's history there. So The Great Pram Race, I love this film. Unfortunately, it exists in terrible quality. I saw a copy on YouTube a few years ago and rang David up and said, this is amazing, you know, you've got the original, haven't you? And he couldn't find it. He said he'd loaned it to someone, it had never come back. So it's nearly completely lost, but fortunately 9.5mm film collector Graham Newnham had a very low resolution copy which he had put on YouTube, and as far as we can find so far, that's all that exists. We'd wanted to run you the whole thing, which is about 10 minutes, but I'm afraid the quality on this size screen won't hold up. So we're just going to run you a 3-minute clip with huge apologies for the quality. If you want to see the whole thing, it's on YouTube. If you look up, I think it's The Great Pram Race 1979. And it's the only film, this isn't in the clip you're about to see, but it's an incentive to watch it later. I think it's the only film ever made in which a professional film archivist loses his pants. So if you want to see that, you can watch the whole thing. Thank you. So I say, do enjoy the other 6 minutes of that on YouTube if you're so inclined. Now, David was most proud, at least in the conversations I always had with him, he was most proud of two series that he'd worked on for Kevin Brownlow and David Gill, who were two of his heroes. And they were the last two documentaries that they made for Thames Television before Photoplay Productions was set up. So one was called Harold Lloyd, the Third Genius, and the other was Buster Keaton, A Hard Act to Follow. And obviously, Buster Keaton was a subject very close to David's heart. Now, he's credited on these as one of the film sources, but officially he was the assistant editor. Now, he actually got promoted to full co-editor on episode 3 of the Buster Keaton documentary. And this relates to the clip we're going to show. We're in a minute going to look at the opening sequence of the Buster Keaton documentary. Now, many years later, I made a film with Kevin about Keaton's later period at MGM, and I was particularly impressed with the opening montage of Hard Act to Follow, and I told David that. And he was rather miffed about that. And he said, well, you know the story about that, don't you? And I said, no. So he was assisting a brilliant editor called Dan Carter, who was the official editor on it. Now, Dan was one of the main editors on the Hollywood series, and he even edited the best one, the stunt one. And he also edited even things like the Hollywood title sequence with the fast cutting of the Bell and Howell camera being cranked. So he was a top editor. But by this time, he was starting to sort of segue off from being an editor to being an antique dealer, meaning that he wasn't actually showing up in the cutting room very much. And on the day that he was supposed to show up to edit the montage, he didn't show up for hours, and David Wyatt had prepped all the possible material he might want and had broken down in those days on film all of the best sort of Keaton gags and bits of action into strips of film hanging up on the trim bin. And finally Dan Carter breezed in at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and cut the sequence in half an hour, which as an editor myself I can't imagine how that's possible. But so he was always rather miffed about the fact that he was able to edit something as complex as this in half an hour, and later then, I say, through Dan's absences, was promoted to editor on the third episode. So we're going to have a look at the first 4 minutes, which includes this montage that I particularly admire, from Buster Keaton, A Hard Act to Follow, assistant editor David Wyatt. Thank you.
When I was 6 months old, we're in some little town, small hotel, and I fell down a full flight of stairs at to the bottom. They come running up. I sat up and just shook my head and shook it off and didn't cry. So they knew I wasn't hurt. And Houdini says that was sure a buster, meaning a fall, because that's the only time it was used. It meant a bronco buster or a fall. It was never used as a name. My father said, well, that would be a good name for him. It don't sound bad.
Buster Keaton. They now call him a genius. Intellectual critics claim him as their own. Yet he never saw himself like that. No man can be a genius, he said, in slap shoes and a flat hat. Keaton had no formal education. He was a totally intuitive artist, most at home working on the mechanics of gags. Yet he had an astonishing understanding of the power of film. The big screen was his element, and on it he displayed a dazzling sense of cinema. Yet his roots were in vaudeville. He mocked the idea that he did everything himself. He always acknowledged his team, but the vision was his. It was in this house in Pequay, Kansas, in 1895, that Joseph Frank Keaton made his first appearance.
Now we're going to have a short tribute from the man who claims to be the world's tallest film historian, Richard M. Roberts. Thank you.
You know, our already small community is, I mean, the herds are thinning. Numbers are not being replicated in anything resembling equal or greater or at all. Look at the average age of the people that you're sitting with and count the number of heads. Interest in these now over or nearly 100-year-old film is not being rekindled in the young. They seem to want to be more offended by them than amused. All we can do is what we can do in the time we have to save, preserve, restore, and share these films in a viable, modern media format. Kick these things down the road one more time and hope that sometime, somewhere, someone in the future will discover them, love them, and share them with others. David Wyatt did his part. And he did it for all the right reasons. He didn't do it for the money. Money! Yeah, sure. Oh, lots of that out there for this. He didn't do it for the fame and glory, Lord knows, that we get in this small, insular group of people who care about something 99.9% of the people in the world could give a damn about. He understood what the right people in this business understand. It's the films that matter. His loss, our loss, is serious. In our little community, the likes of Dave Wyatt is always here. So, remember him. His collection remains. His work continues. You do what you can to keep him alive.
So, it's the films that matter. Well, we haven't really covered that much of the films themselves that David was so fond of. So we're now going to have two extracts, accompanied by Colin Sell, of two films that David was particularly fond of, which have been picked out by Dave Glass. The first is an extract from The Simp, starring Lloyd Hamilton. And Lloyd Hamilton was, of course, the first of the crowd-funded DVD releases that the two Daves put together. And Lloyd Hamilton was a particular favourite of David's. And after that, we'll go straight into a section from Family Life, which is a little-known Jack White mermaid comedy. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Colin. Now, to finish with, we have one last little treasure to share with you. David Cleveland preserved the outtakes from Vision On and Jigsaw, and there are a few wonderful, if tiny, glimpses of our friend. And the music for this final sequence is a nod to another giant that we've lost from the silent film scene, and someone that David was very, very proud to have worked with on 2 occasions, Carl Davis. Thank you.